folks. Might do a little bit of background. As Julie said, I didn't see Gavin's paper. I knew some of the previous work, not all of it. And I don't know how much you want me to engage with it.
It's up to you.
Typically, I mean, like, I guess I can say there's quite a lot I agree with, quite a lot I think is fundamentally wrong, which is completely inaccurate. But just to let you know, I wrote a thesis on the development of untitled sociology. And the bottom line of that one was, let's get on with actually doing sociology of education properly. And so that's kind of what I'm going to try to do here, just so you know. And part of what I'm presenting is material I've done before, and part of it is essentially a kind of what I'm working at now. I'm trying to think through. The biographical stuff I probably should give you a warning about. Yes, I know I am in Australia known for school reform studies. I should say that's quite accidental. So it happens, yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know how it happened. Anyway, disciplinarily, my last degree was in sociology of school knowledge in a sociology department that does have a social theorist and sociological theorist program. Alongside of a long tradition of statistician work out of Blau and Duncan, we're talking Wisconsin-Madison here, alongside of the Haven Center, which is Marxist theory and sociological framework, alongside of a sociology of education program that feeds both of those and has its own kind of posting and Marxist framework. So my last point of venture was a kind of smattering of quite a large agenda. To stay alive, I worked in a research center that was working on school reform. So that's been paying my bills, basically. But when I do the work, I kind of think about them all. Probably should warn you, my second degree was in philosophy, straight philosophy. And my first degree was in mathematics, so I was trained methodologically as an ethnographer by an anthropologist. I ended up doing quantitative stuff in Australia because nobody else could do it, and I had to learn how to do it myself. So that's a bit of the background. What I want to talk about today is I'm trying to place a lot of the work I've been doing in the last 20-odd years in Australia in a larger context and give some kind of reflection on it. I just want to point out a couple background conditions. All right? One of the background conditions I think we continually live in is a perpetual state of crisis. There used to be a time when we talked about cyclical crises in economic terms. That's not been the case my entire life. That is, my entire life has lived on the tail end of the baby boom, where every institution I've run into has been an economic crisis because all the money was blown on the first wave of the baby boom. Right, literally, austerity budgets, et cetera, et cetera. When I first went into university, Reagan cut all the funding because it had all been blown on the baby boomers, and Australia has its equivalent. The baby boomers get free university education. When I moved here, that ended, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But the interesting point is where even there are notable points of national economies that are supposedly in good state and good growth, the global threat has been used to talk about a notion of crisis for the nation, right? So it never goes away. It's always been there. And this is where I think Gavin is entirely right. Globalization studies annoy the hell out of me because I think they got it wrong. Globalization's been around a lot longer than globalization studies. And it's not new, and it's not an object. It's something that, anyway, we can go on through that one. At the same time, we've got what has now been named, in a lovely term, GERM. It's Global Educational Reform Movement. And that term comes from Pasi, the head of the Finnish kind of education department. A colleague and friend that I met through a colleague who does sociology of education in Helsinki. By the name of Hunter Simola. He and I studied together, et cetera, et cetera. But GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement, is also now quite global. It's been going on my whole entire life. A lot of the reforms that were argued for when I was in primary school are now global. They return, they come and go. I mean, if you listen to Ken Robinson, you basically hear the rationale for reforms for which I was in pilot studies as a child, right? So, pardon me if I seem a little jaded, but I've seen it. Okay, well, part of this larger kind of what I would, not just me, many people have talked about is the world culture of schooling. is an ostensible commitment to equity. And that kind of varies depending on where you are and when you're talking between some kind of notion of equal opportunity, some kind of notion of equal outcome. And sometimes you get a retreat. In Australia, you have a definitive retreat where there was a statement explicitly made in the late 90s about a commitment to equal outcomes, social outcomes, and now when you look at the national policy around the legislation that's out there, it's kind of stated as a pipe dream, right? So there's no longer a commitment to actually reach it. There, we're going to try to kind of statement. I can't remember the exact wording. Has anybody seen it? The legislation is really fascinating. Australia supposedly could be number 5 by 2025. Anyway, so you get all that. And just little other bits of background, little things that have been in the news lately I want you to keep in mind, and why I think sociological theory is definitely not dead and definitely needed. There was a recent, about 5 days ago, reported in Science Express. This is the advanced form of the journal Science. A report of a genome study which is claimed to found an association between 3 DNA clusters, I'll call them SNPs, they're known as, I don't know if you know these, association between them and educational attainment. And some of the headlines have been really interesting. Two of the people were at my uni, so it was on the uni website, and the local paper picked it up. And the local paper's version of it was to say, oh, we found the gene that explains educational attainment. When you read the study, that's not exactly what it said at all. Quite the contrary. In fact, what they found is that of all the genes, this is called a GWAS, a genome-wide association study, it's called. They go around searching for all different kinds of genes potentially associated with, in this case, educational attainment, and they're using attainment being how far you go in school. And lo and behold, yes, they have found these 3, and these 3 explain less than 2% of the variance. Right? So there you go. You got the argument, and I just kind of chuckle, because it like reconfirms what I've been arguing all along. Thank you very much, etc. But the local media don't see it that way. I'm going to be using some concepts that I figured it dawned on me I probably need to explain, particularly for recent kind of RHD students. Gavin will know these. People that study this stuff in the past. Reification is a concept I'll be using. It's largely, just so you know, probably best articulated by Lukács in the early 1920s. This is the notion of the way in which things that are abstract get pulled together into something that is seen as concrete. And in particular, there are 2 notions of social relations that Lukács worried about. One is the way in which we make ourselves objects. People become objects of themselves. And therefore, you got a sense of self that's somehow concretized outside who you are, et cetera, et cetera. And the other is social relations. And different forms of social relations become a commodity. This is, by the way, the basis of Bourdieu's notion of capitals, particularly social and cultural capital, but also economic capital, which was Lukács' focus. Beyond that, then there's the question of commodity fetishism, and here's where commodities are being used and or become objects of fetish, where a desire for objects that were kind of artificially constructed become pervasive. And the extension of market logic, et cetera, has been identified as being driven by commodity fetishism. Both of these were generated by Marx himself about 160, 180 years ago. So if they sound like they're describing reality now, please remember where they come from. Commodity fetishism, by the way, comes from a critique of religion, which I think currently is really quite funny. Okay. In addition to that, I'm going to be using notions of decoupling. Decoupling comes out of what's known as the new institutionalism, and it's not a new concept, but it's a nice phrase for talking about the way in which we construct institutions. We have a logic that we tell ourselves about how these things work, but they don't really work that way, right? So we've got a logic that says you've got a school system that runs from primary into secondary, and there's going to be gradual learning along the way, and they're kind of developmentally. But when you look at how kids experience it, it ain't that. We've got a logic that says you're going to get a credential, and if you're going to get a credential in a secondary school, that's going to have an economic benefit, and that's not true, right? So there's all these kind of decouplings that go on. Alongside of that, you get expansive structuration, which is despite the fact that they don't really work the way we say they do in public rhetoric, and why you do need theory to name what people don't see. expansion strategy, people keep doing it. And they keep doing more of it. And they keep saying, oh, more of it's going to be better. So now we got to push for increased participation in tertiary education in Australia, and that's going to do something for equity, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that we now have in the 80s a shift from about 40% of the population finishing secondary school to about in the early 90s, that being above 80 to 85, 90, depending on what year you're talking, the value of the secondary credential has dropped like a rock simply because everybody has one. Right? If you really want to tell me there's some kind of relationship between graduating in high school and actually knowing something, well, you might get a little struggle on that one, right? Okay. In amongst all of this, I'm going to also using the notion of aporias. There's a long tradition of this out of philosophy, but basically it's a way of talking about how when logic systems are constructed, there's also always blind spots. There's things you don't see. Or there's internal contradictions that cannot be solved. That's known as an aporia. There's quite a few of them. Kant responded to what he identified as some. Hegel responded to Kant's, et cetera, et cetera. And then came Marx. Okay, I just want to point out, school reform, there's some things we know. Actually, we actually do know stuff about school reform that a lot of people have forgotten. One is there's little reason to believe the current credentialing of teachers is going to have any impact on student outcomes. It's a form of decoupling. I mean, saying somebody has a credential and they're certified doesn't actually mean they can teach well, nor, even if it does, they can teach well, that they do it on a regular basis. That ain't gonna happen. We also know there's little to believe that nationalizing curriculum is gonna have any substantial input, right? We have little, we know the shifts in structures and departments are not gonna have any effect on student outcomes. That is departments of education, government structures. It's happening all the time, right? Shifts in teacher education, they're not gonna change schools. Despite all the reviews, and I think there's been 28 since I've been here. Right? Okay, we know any temporary reform is likely not to be sustained, and Queensland's the obvious point. Just look at the new basics. Came, gone, right? And as Anna Bly told Alan, you've had your 5 years, be happy. Right? That's a quote, by the way. It was an interesting conversation to watch. Okay, we also know that most policy is very decoupled from any schooling. Okay, so these are background things we actually know, and we know it largely from sociological studies. We also know a lot about the sources of student outcomes, so even if we assume and agree with this germ, this global, and we want to do something about student outcomes, there's some stuff we do know. We know that there's a large portion of the variance in student outcomes comes from outside anything the school does. Some of it's individual difference, some of it's identified as individual related social cultural stuff outside of the schools. We know there's estimates of the exogenous factors are part and parcel. We measure these things these days. And that comes straight out of the Blound-Duncan tradition, by the way. We can talk about that. We also know individual schools are not the source of systemic impacts. Differentiated systems have differential effects. Schools within those systems pick up what they can handle, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to show you some graphs on this, by the way, using data. Right? This is PISA results. Right? And now PISA, you'll see this shape in every international study of student outcomes. You'll see it with NAPLAN. The shape's slightly different because NAPLAN is a really odd beast, I gotta tell you. But basically what you have here are the 360 schools that were in PISA. An estimate of their average score, in this case, this is just a mass score, right? The little triangles in the middle of these are the mean score identified by PISA, and the whiskers are the confidence intervals. That is, how much do we really know the mean is there as opposed to somewhere else? All right? So far, so good? Notice two things about this. If you look across the middle, say from here to here, we don't know they're any different from each other. They're all the same, right? The only thing we really know is there's about 10% down at the bottom, which is different than about 10% at the top, and that's the extent of what we know. Right? This is called understanding the error of surveys. What does this tell you? Think about this for a second. But while you're thinking about what it tells you, think about the way it's planned out in public rhetoric around policy. There is a disjunction here. Okay? We know that when this kind of study, this is cross-sectional study, you're going to get about 10 or 15% of the variance between schools. Overall variance, 10 or 15%. We know that most of the difference within schools is and about 40 to 45% you can talk about just to do with something going on within the school, and about another 40% is at the individual level. Okay? Then you can start figuring out how much of the individual has to do with their individual social background. You can look at school level, you can look at all these kind of things. Think about that. We have known this, by the way, since 1966. And James Coleman did the Equal Opportunity Survey. All right? Now, the different countries have had different takes on how to respond to this phenomenon. But think about this. What are our policies currently talking about? Well, they're talking about school differences, and they're going to give money to give principals, regulation, et cetera, under the argument that schools have a lot to do with the differences in achievement. Well, they don't. Schools don't. They're going to give the money, and then they complain about individual teachers. Now, that assumes that this within-school variance is all attributable to a teacher, by the way. It's an assumption that Ken Rowe made, and it's an assumption, and I can tell you about the mathematics that leads to that, by the way. Teachers in these equations are known as dummy variables. And they're called dummy variables because they're simply categories. Teacher A, teacher B, and there's students within teacher A, students within teacher B, right? Et cetera, down the line. All right, however, when you start thinking, what can schools do about it, you gotta look at growth. You gotta look at differences between students over different time periods. And you can do that with data these days. And I can tell you right now, in Queensland, in that plan, in mathematics, the amount of variance that has anything to do with the school is about 2%. 2%. Okay? Literacy has 4%. Difference. Now that's not accounting for the social background of the school. Just the school itself. As soon as I add in the social background of the school, that drops. Goes to nothing. Okay. Most of the variance has to do within schools. And I'll know there's two different things. There's the overall level, there's the growth over time, right? Typical measures of equity account for very, very little overall variance. That is, if I start trying to attribute any of this to social background, particularly growth. If you try to attribute social background to growth, good luck. Because as soon as you control for prior achievement, you've written out all the social background. Almost all of it, not quite, right? And herein we have the classic grounds for misrecognition. People keep talking about things that I would argue simply do not exist, right? I find it fascinating. The vast majority of the variance in these kind of models lies at the individual level, and you got to sit there and try to understand it. There's a heavy reliance on unquestioned categories in all of this. Organizationally, we keep talking about schools and teachers as if they exist as a way of explaining this data, right? Okay, I'm going to give you a narrative story. For the last 8 years, I've been working in the far west of New South Wales in the Western Desert in Mad Max territory, literally, that's Mad Max territory, in an Aboriginal community school. Last year, when I was there for my 7th year, I was standing on the playground talking to the art teacher. It was a part-time art teacher that lived in Broken Hill, and he drives out 3 days a week. Right? You see weird things in the outback, right? Fish swimming across the road in the middle of a desert. That happened. Anyway, as I was talking to the art teacher, we're looking around, we realized no one else in the school that worked for the school had been there as long as we had. I don't even work there, and I've been there longer than anybody else. If you try to talk about this school as an entity over time, good luck. The shift of individual people is such that every time I go out there, which is 4 times a year, it's a different constellation. It's a different beast. So to call it a school is to say where the building is, end of story, as far as I'm concerned. It's constantly being reconstructed, palpably. And the community comes and goes too. You know, families get annoyed, they leave, other people, you know. So there's a lot of shift with the kids too. Okay, teacher. Well, if you're trying to explain student outcomes, if you have kids, you realize that one individual teacher is such a minute part of the story. Why do we focus on it? Right? My daughter in high school, you know, she's got like 12 different teachers she has to deal with. And they come and go, and she kind of passes that along. Even in primary school, you know, 3 teachers, 4 teachers at a time from one year to the next. 2 years in NAPLAN, you're looking at 8 different teachers contributing. This is why the value-added debate is a serious one. You want to take student growth attributed to an individual teacher? Good luck. You need about 8 years of data to do it reliably, by the way. This is where my first degree comes in handy. Now I get a bit of mathematics. Okay, but take a look at the categories. Teacher, school. What are the assumptions and policies that get made? Oh, we're going to do something about low SES schools. There's an assumption there that there's a community, as if that exists, and it equals what the student faces, as if that exists. Even in a small town of less than 300, I think you'd have a hard time trying to say where I've been working actually has a community. There's multiple communities, and there's a real serious divide on the black-white line, right? But there's others. And I already whinged about the teacher. But there's also a notion that in the data, you get within school variance, and we're going to say that's all the teacher. A dummy variable. Okay? So you actually, when you start doing this kind of modeling, you realize the assumptions people are making along the way. What the heck are these people doing? Okay. So this is one problem. We've got a problem in which categories are being taken to actually be real when they're simply categories used to analyze a set of numbers, right? So I would argue that they're dubious empirical validity, and then you can start going back to the equity ones that we're continually using. We are using a notion of SES, which, by the way, ICSIA doesn't measure, not even remotely closely, by the way. And the notion of SES is itself conceptually problematic. There is a whole line of class analysis that had debates about how to define class. In England, you got Goldthorpe. In the US, you got Eric Cohen Wright. They've done a whole bunch of empirical stuff to try to tease out different class models. And then you've got people that have no economic knowledge whatsoever doing it and claiming there's 9 classes in the UK. Sorry, that's a jab at Tony Bennett, among other people, based on a really superficial reading of Bourdieu. Anyway, that's another reading. And then you get the others, gender. There still is a continual confusion between gender and sex, and people talk about gender as if it's the same thing as talking about boys and girls, and they assume it's monolithic, et cetera, et cetera. That continues on. There's a continual confusion around race and culture. People talk about race as if there is some kind of biological entity called race, a concept biologists got away from a long time ago, right? Et cetera, et cetera. That continues on. And then, on top of that, we have this perpetual slippage in Australian sociology of education of acting like we're in a normative position of telling people what to do, which I find really fascinating. But it comes down to, I was going to use some real quotes, but then I realized if I do the citation, in a driving world, it's probably not a good idea to create more enemies. So I'll just paraphrase from a recent textbook by a high-status publisher that's supposed to be on sociology of education, where they're describing Bourdieu's theory of notion of classes, and then the next claim comes, these categories create society and a stratification in society. And the argument is that the theory is the one that did the stratification. Talk about presumed agency, as if our categories have an impact. I love the fact that we get all this so-called critical work and they have to change the world. People that think they've read Thesis 11, and they have an N of the one. One time in history, the social theory actually led to some kind of major political change. And that wasn't all that good. The Russian Revolution didn't work all that well. All right? Okay, here we go. We have in the current policy landscape, I do worry about policy, because I worry about what people do with money, right? That is how systems are run. I'm going to have to speed up, sorry. Workable data systems. We actually have data systems now. There's policies of choice and merit. The choice and merit argument is fascinating. The whole basis of the choice and merit argument is based on categories that don't exist. Choice between schools, as if schools matter. The only thing that matters is the social capital in private schools of any serious consequence at a school level. We have inherited living interpretations and knowledge about school variance. I've already bagged that one. Social accord supporting all these things. People buy into it on a regular basis. You got to start asking, why do they buy into it? Why do they go along with it? We've got bureaucratic that function reasonably well. Bureaucracies, mind you, favors analysis of bureaucracy is really relevant here, seriously relevant. Bureaucracies don't get smaller, they get bigger. They're really good at self-rationalizing. They're really good at creating career structures in them. You know, the yes minister stuff wasn't a joke. It does happen. We have recent passing interest in something about social inclusion that comes and goes, but look at what has happened over time. Yes, there has been changes around gender in how far women have gone in education, and you know, they're pushing the quote-unquote class ceiling. There's been some shifts in some countries around race. African Americans in the US are doing reasonably well in entering the middle class. And you've got the exceptional case of making stupid amounts of money playing golf, etc. But has there been any shift at all in socioeconomic status in relation to education? Nothing. Zero. Huh? Okay. At the same time that's happening, if you go out and talk to teachers, and we've got studies on these, you'll see a persistence of using these categories. You'll see a persistence of old agreed claims. People talk about gender and SES and race in the same way they talked about in the past, and they use it in the same homogenizing fashion, and they use it in the same way that was identified as so-called deficit theorizing. But additional to that, we have an amazing persistence of a lack of self-reflectivity. Not just among the teachers, but among the people constructing this theorizing. And I would argue, in education, there's an interesting case now. Where I am in Newcastle, people are bagging on about doing all kinds of new theory, et cetera. And you know, 25 years ago, I quipped that there was nothing so old that's claiming to be new. Right? And that's still happening. And I'm not sure it's good theory at all. I think Gavin's quite right about a lot of it. It's intensely superficial, with no reading of the original sources. I mean, it's been a long time since I actually necessarily read Durkheim. Right? Okay. Let me give you an example of what happens when you do this. When you enter into these kind of things, you start studying schooling and how schooling works, and you miss the obvious, right? Within schools, studies in Australia have not looked at all at what was a major enterprise in sociology of education in other parts of the world, that is, within school stratification. There are literally less than a handful of studies that have looked at this in Australia over the last 25 years, even though it was identified by Connell et al. In 1982. And I'm just going to illustrate it. This is data we have on our pedagogical studies. You know, I talk about school reform oddly becoming popular. I mean, I created this pedagogy model to do an analysis, and the next thing I know, people are using it for PD and making an argument that it had an impact before we had any data. Look familiar? This is if I do a teacher average of pedagogy and I map out the differences between teachers. Look familiar? Yes, I can tell you 10% of teachers look a lot different than another 10% of teachers, and everybody else in the middle is pretty much the same. Right? If I was going to draw a boredom in classroom line, by the way, it would probably be about here, you know, where the vast majority of kids are totally bored. So I reckon there's a lot we can do to make things less boring just by nudging pedagogy a little bit. Right? But anyway. Notice, this is using New South Wales data to do what I was trying to do in Queensland when they never gave me prior achievement data. Take an average prior achievement measure in a classroom. That's that. It's on the New South Wales BST, Basic Skills Test, which is now the formation map line. Take a total of the measures of supposed quality of pedagogy in the classroom on that side. And what I was looking for in the studies we were doing was trying to find what happens when you get the exceptional case. You get, you know, what are the effects of high quality pedagogy where they typically don't get it? Well, that would appear in this graph up in the upper left-hand quadrant. You can see the total number of examples of that I have. 0. So with data, I can fundamentally make the claim about schooling as a self-reproducing society, reproducing function. Right? There's a large amount of variance, we saw that. It's not simply between teachers, I just showed you that. It's between classes. Much of the variance is in between classes, and there's a big relationship between what kind of pedagogy you get and prior achievement. And that begs the question, how are these kids being formed into groups? And what are they getting in those different groups? That, my friend, is known as streaming and tracking studies and classification and questions of stratification within school. The best we have on this kind of stuff, Robin Zevenberger, now Jorgensen, did one ARC on student grouping mathematics. There's about 3 or 4 articles out of that. You've got subject selection choice studies by Amy et al. From ACR, who, by the way, ACR, when it was created, was funded by the Rockefeller Center. Right, just so you know. Carnegie, 1933, under the same agenda as Rockefeller. Sorry, yeah, when you were mentioning that, I thought, yep. And they went global a long time ago. Okay, so you get the point. We've got all this stuff, but very little studies. We've got T's, and this is important, T's and Lamb, talking about the importance of SES in relation to subject choice within the last years of the high school, and that having an impact. At the same time as we have people who do studies where they control for prior achievement and say SES doesn't matter at all, and they're both right. The problem is you need to understand the mechanisms that lead to them both being correct, and we don't have that. All right. I'll come down, by the way, if I was going to study it, this is the kind of path I would hypothesize and then start seeing how much of it is true. That is, if you map kids from primary all the way through to high school, I bet you can find pathways. All right? We already know a lot about that. There's different ways of measuring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to get down to what it's got to do. What I'm currently thinking through is understanding the political economy of this, right? That is, we've got a prevalence of fixed categories, okay? We've got a stagnated debate around deficit theorizing. Now, the deficit theorizing debate is absolutely stagnated because it's on two sides of the issue. On one hand, you have people saying, oh, you shouldn't engage in deficit theorizing, and then you have people doing it. And that's about the extent of it. Typically, the people who say don't engage in deficit theorizing then evacuate any notion of structural power in society and start talking about as if you're making kids feel good, it's going to do something about structural changes in power. All right. We've got a prevalence of the normative appeal to teachers, and I just want to point out that most of what's happening in sociology of education is directly a consequence of it no longer having a disciplinary base, of being forced into either being categorized by the ARC as belonging to sociology departments that doesn't want it in the first place and won't do any of it, right? There's, I think, 3 people in sociology have done anything in education, right? One's just gone on maternity leave over at UQ, and the other's still down under the remnants AAU, right? Okay, so you got that problem. And then in education, you got the evacuation of foundations altogether because it's now totally vocational. And as a consequence, we have this perpetual appeal to teachers as if they're good people, right? So all our research has to end with some wonderful moral message about how the virtues of teachers, and if you do anything else, you're tagged with blaming the teacher. I find it fascinating debate. All right, herein lies we've got a perfect system of the fetishization of commodities, of education itself, of equity indicators becoming markets. You got managers out there getting jobs because they're going to do a good job of equity, right? And they use key performance indicators. Right? And we've used this in the whole thing. And all along, what are we doing? We are generating yet another education system that is, if nothing else, multiplied the legitimating functions of education. It's become multiplicative. We've intensified the economic. And it's only challenged with the most facile, predictable reforms. Oh, we got to be progressive. Had they not read Bernstein 1966? Right? Commodification of human relations and now generally unquestioned. Absolutely unquestioned. That what you talk about is making yourself more credible. And that's what it is to be human. I'll leave it there.